Well, good morning, everyone. Morning. How are you doing today? Well, welcome back for the second day of the Chautauqua Lecture Series, Ohio Presidents. Thank you. For today, we are fortunate that Todd Arrington has joined us for Celebrate Ohio to share his knowledge of James Garfield. Todd is a 25-year career employee of the National Park Service. He grew up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which fueled his passion for American history and his desire to have a National Park Service career. And this morning's session is Let Us Not Shrink Now, James Garfield, Civil Rights and the Civil War's Legacy. This presentation will examine Garfield's life and record as an abolitionist, congressman, and U.S. president. As a reminder, later this afternoon there'll be a presentation on the remarkable lives and legacies of the First Ladies of Ohio here at Orchestra Hall at 3:30. And as always, I do ask if you please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Todd Arrington.
Good morning. Well, my first question was going to be, can you hear me? But I think we've solved that mystery already, so the mic is working. Thank you. Thanks for the very kind introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk to you about James Garfield as the Lakeside Chautauqua explores the impacts and legacies of the Ohioans who have served as President of the United States. In the case of James Garfield, exploring his impact allows us to look from the Civil War, in which he served as both a Union soldier and an Ohio congressman, to the post-Civil War period known as Reconstruction and beyond. James Garfield's Civil War service was all in the Western Theater, the same theater that produced such luminaries as Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, and others. They were both Ohioans too, by the way. But if we're going to understand the post-Civil War period that we call Reconstruction, then James Garfield does in fact play an important role here as well. We have a lot to learn from this Ohioan that all too briefly occupied the presidential chair, the same chair in which Abraham Lincoln once sat, making decisions not just about the Civil War itself, but also the direction in which the nation should go after the Civil War ended. In my view, the only one that matters because I have the microphone, James Garfield was the last true so-called Lincoln Republican to become President of the United States. Garfield was the last Republican president that harkened back to the origins of that party as one that sought equality for all and saw an active and activist federal government as the best means to achieve it. Had he not been assassinated early in his term, who knows how differently the history of the late 19th century might read in our history books today. And if the history of the late 19th century read differently, perhaps the histories of the 20th and the 21st centuries that we've all known would read differently as well. So, just who was James Garfield? If you know anything at all about him, it's probably one of these facts, which people say to us all the time at James A. Garfield National Historic Site. He had a beard. He was president. He got shot. These are all true, by the way. Because his presidency was so brief, Garfield is to most Americans a historical footnote, one of those unimportant, bearded, Gilded Age Republicans that Thomas Wolfe once called the Lost Americans, and about whom he wrote, "Their gravelly, vacant, and bewhiskered faces mixed, melted, and swam together. Which had the whiskers? Which the sideburns? Which was which?" In other words, asks Wolfe, did these guys really matter? The answer is, surprisingly, yes. Of course they mattered. All presidents, good, bad, or mediocre, matter and impact our history for decades after they leave office. For example, James Buchanan, until recently the only native Pennsylvanian, my home state, to become president, considered by many to be one of, if not the worst presidents in American history. But I defy any of you to tell me that his administration, which did little to prevent Southern secession and civil war, didn't matter. If nothing else, look who came after him and had to clean up his mess. It was Abraham Lincoln, by the way. And certainly in the era of the Civil War and Reconstruction, no president could be passive and ignore the events swirling around him as Buchanan did before the Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant, long considered a failure as a president, is now getting a second look, and a favorable one too, from historians. And I think Rutherford B. Hayes, for all the talk of the Republicans stealing the 1876 election, was actually a far better chief executive than he's been given credit for too. And that, of course, brings us to James Garfield. Admittedly, historians will not find much in Garfield's brief presidency to increase his standing in the next C-SPAN poll of presidential greatness. But if you scratch the surface just a little bit and learn more about Garfield's early life and career, you'll see that he stood on the right side of many issues in our history, including some that we're still wrestling with to some degree or another today. Maybe, just maybe, he could have been a successful president if he had lived. James Abram Garfield was born on the Western Reserve of Ohio on November 19th, 1831. He was the last president born in a log cabin. That is also true. His father died when young James was just 18 months old, and he grew up in extreme poverty. His family was so poor, in fact, that when his mother gave him her life savings so he could attend school, it amounted to $17. Garfield worked jobs as a carpenter, janitor, and teacher to put himself through first the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Hiram, Ohio, and then Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Garfield went to Williams as a devout member of the Disciples of Christ, believing that a true Christian should avoid the corrupting influence of politics. But the atmosphere he found at Williams soon changed his views. In November 1855, after hearing a speech about the fighting between pro- and anti-slavery settlers in Kansas, Garfield wrote in his diary, "I have been instructed tonight on the political condition of our country. At such hours as this, I feel like throwing the whole current of my life into the work of opposing this giant evil. The religion of Christ demands some such action." And of course, the giant evil he referred to there was the institution of slavery. Garfield soon came to understand and accept that participation in the political process was in fact necessary to defeat the giant evil of slavery. After graduating from Williams in 1856, Garfield returned to Northeast Ohio, becoming first a teacher at and eventually the principal of the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute. He married Lucretia Rudolph in 1858 and settled into the life of a small-town college administrator. By mid-1859, though, local Republicans were courting him to run for the state Senate. After making them promise that he would not have to campaign, very different system than we have today, Garfield agreed to stand for election. He won his first election with ease and traveled to Columbus to take his seat in the State House at the end of 1859. Just 28 years old, James Garfield was now on the political path that would eventually carry him to the White House. The Republicans ran Garfield as a strong anti-slavery candidate in 1859, and his speeches both in the State House and around his district did not disappoint. Though he stated publicly that he believed secession nearly impossible, he spoke at more than 40 meetings in favor of the Republican presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln in 1860. His efforts paid off when Lincoln won Garfield's district by almost 3,000 votes. Garfield got his first look at Lincoln in February 1861 when the president-elect stopped in Columbus on his way to Washington, D.C. But through all his awkward homeliness, he wrote his wife about Lincoln, there is a look of transparent, genuine goodness, which at once reaches your heart and makes you trust and love him. He has the tone and bearing of a fearless, fine man, and I have great hope for the government. But Lincoln moved more slowly against slavery than Garfield expected, and over the next several years, Garfield grew more and more frustrated with Lincoln until his opinion festered into, as one historian called it, cold contempt for Abraham Lincoln. When Southerners fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, Garfield was incensed, but also keenly aware of the root cause of the conflict. 2 days after the attack, he wrote to a friend, "I am glad we are defeated at Sumter. It will rouse the people. I can see no possible end to the war until the South is subjugated. Better to lose 1,000,000 men in battle than allow the government to be overthrown. The war will soon assume the shape of slavery and freedom. The world will so understand it, and I believe the final outcome will redound to the good of humanity." Garfield volunteered to fight for the Union, helping to raise and equip a regiment that eventually became the 42nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Service in the Army hardened his feelings about slavery and slave owners. As a regimental and brigade commander, he sent Northern men into battle against rebels who he believed fought to perpetuate and expand slavery and to keep the nation permanently split. "Before God, I here record my conviction," he wrote in 1862, "that the spirit of slavery is the soul of the rebellion and the incarnate devil which must be cast out before we can trust in any peace as lasting and secure." In 1862, Republicans nominated Garfield as their candidate to represent Ohio's 19th congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was elected easily, but was torn between staying in the Army or going to Congress. He certainly preferred the idea of going to the House, especially as his frustration with the direction of the war grew. He fumed at professional West Point educated officers that seemed hesitant to take the war to the Southern populace, insisting that if the North lost the war, let its obituary be written thus: "Died of West Point." Garfield rejoiced in September 1862 when President Lincoln finally issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation and made the war about more than just saving the Union. "The President's proclamation gives great satisfaction among strong, vigorous men," he wrote. "The President's heart is right. God grant that he may have the full strength to stand up to his convictions and carry them out to the full." Still, Garfield's opinion of Lincoln remained relatively low. "Strange," he wrote, "that a second-rate Illinois lawyer should be the instrument through which one of the sublimest works of any age is accomplished." Northeast Ohio Republicans elected Garfield to Congress in the fall of 1862, but the congressional schedule of that era meant that he would not actually take office until late 1863. So he had another year to spend in the Army before going to Washington, D.C. He spent most of that year as Chief of Staff to the Army of the Cumberland, then commanded by Major General William S. Rosecrans, yes, another Ohioan. People from other states did fight in the Civil War too, but it just seems like Ohio was, produced so many great ones. Then in late 1863, General Garfield traveled to Washington to become Congressman Garfield. The House of Representatives he entered as a freshman was dominated by men soon to be known as radical Republicans, including Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, Schuyler Colfax of Indiana, Justin Morrill of Vermont, Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, Henry Winter Davis of Maryland, and Elihu Washburn of Illinois. Across the aisle sat Northern Democrats, many of whom believed the war to be a failure and a waste of lives and money. They included New York's Fernando Wood, Ohio's George Pendleton and Samuel Sunset Cox, Indiana's Daniel Voorhees, Indiana's William Holman, and Pennsylvania's Samuel Randall. Over the next 17 years, James Garfield built a reputation as one of the Republican Party's foremost orators. During Reconstruction, he allied himself much of the time with the radical Republicans and was a reliable vote for measures intended to guarantee the civil and political rights and physical safety of black men and women in the South. He recognized the political and economic power of slavery in the South, stating, "It is well known that the power of slavery rests in large plantations, and that the bulk of all the real estate is in the hands of slave owners who have plotted this great conspiracy," meaning, of course, secession and the Civil War. He took a hard line on the fate he believed should await Confederate generals and politicians after the war, saying, "Set it down at once that the leaders of this rebellion must be executed or banished from the Republic. Let the republic drive from its soil the traitors that have conspired against its life, as God and his angels drove Satan and his host from heaven. He spoke in favor of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, saying, "To me it is a matter of great surprise that gentlemen on the other side should wish to delay the death of slavery. Has slavery not betrayed and slain men enough? Are they not strewn across 1,000 battlefields? Its best friends know that its final hour is fast approaching. The avenging gods are on its track." On July 4th, 1865, in Ravenna, Ohio, Garfield delivered an address entitled "Suffrage and Slavery," in which he sounded quite a bit like Lincoln in his Gettysburg Address, challenging the nation to live up to the promises of the Declaration of Independence. Quote, "In the great crisis of the war, God brought us face to face with the mighty truth that we must lose our freedom or grant it to the slave. Have we done it? Have we given freedom to the black man? What is freedom? Is it mere negation? Is it the bare privilege of not being chained, of not being bought and sold, branded and scourged? If this is all, then freedom is a bitter mockery, a cruel delusion, and it may well be questioned whether slavery were not better." One prominent Garfield biographer writes that, quote, "Once the pressures of wartime were lifted, Garfield's commitment to radicalism began to cool." This author posits that radicalism did not come naturally to Garfield, who at his core had, quote, "a reflective, essentially passive personality." This explanation, to me at least, is a bit too simple and does not account for another aspect of Garfield's personality. Namely, he was an extremely astute politician with an uncanny ability to read the public mood. "I am trying to do two things," he told his friend Burke Hinsdale in the late 1860s, "be a radical and not be a fool, which, if I am to judge by the exhibitions around me, is a matter of no small difficulty." Garfield was a committed radical until a particular issue or situation required him not to be. On May 30th, 1868, the Grand Army of the Republic hosted the first ever National Decoration Day ceremony in Arlington National Cemetery. The forerunner of modern Memorial Day, which we just celebrated a couple of weeks ago, Decoration Day was intended to remember the soldiers killed defending the Union and freeing the enslaved during the Civil War by placing flowers on their graves. Garfield was already viewed at this point as a rising star and powerful speaker among his congressional colleagues, and the GAR chose him to deliver the keynote address at this event. Garfield did not disappoint, honoring his fallen Union colleagues while also reminding everyone of the significance of the location, Arlington House having once been Robert E. Lee's home, and the war's true legacy. Garfield said, "We began the war for the Union alone, but we had not gone far into its darkness before a new element was added to the conflict. In lessons that could not be misunderstood, the nation was taught that God had linked to our own the destiny of an enslaved race, that their liberty and our union were indeed one and inseparable. 7 years ago, this was the home of one who lifted his sword against the life of his country. The soil beneath our feet was watered by the tears of slaves, in whose hearts the sight of yonder proud capital awakened no pride and inspired no hope. The face of the goddess that crowns it was turned toward the sea and not towards them." During the Ulysses S. Grant presidential years, Garfield regularly rejected the overtures of Republicans who tried to invoke party loyalty to convince him to run for governor of Ohio, at one point remarking that any justice of the peace in Cleveland has more to do than the governor of Ohio. Diverting his career away from Washington and back toward Columbus was not an option. Garfield viewed Grant's second term, which began in 1873, with trepidation when it came to affairs in the South. Louisiana, one of the most corrupt and violent former Confederate states, was particularly troublesome, leading Garfield to fear that much of Reconstruction had been a failure. In Louisiana, his fellow Republicans often cheated to win elections, while white Democrats were more overt and often resorted to intimidation of black voters or outright murder. Politics there had, in Garfield's view, deteriorated to a contest between, quote, a reckless set of scamps and the armed Negro-hating band of murderers. In 1875, federal troops stormed the Louisiana State House and forced enough Democrats out of the legislature that the Republicans were able to organize it and establish a majority. Even for a partisan Republican like Garfield, this was an ugly development. I have never given wholly away to despondency, he wrote, but this is the darkest day for the future of the Republican Party I have ever seen. The Louisiana question now appears to be the millstone that threatens to sink our party out of sight. Garfield did not fear that this incident would lead to retribution from whites against blacks. After all, white Southerners in Louisiana and other states were already openly hostile to black people and frequently turned to violence against them. Garfield's real concern in Louisiana was that it would lead to a backlash against Reconstruction among Northerners. Such a reaction could ultimately lead to the government abandoning black people in the South unless additional civil rights legislation was passed. God taught us early in this fight, he said on the House floor, that the fate of our own race was indissolubly linked with that of the black man. Justice to them has always been safety for us. Let us not shrink now. Garfield's plea fell on mostly deaf ears. As Grant's presidency neared its end, and once Grant dispelled rumors he would run for an unprecedented third term in 1876, many Republicans tried to position themselves to succeed him. Garfield put little stock in the prospects of Ohio's Republican governor, Rutherford B. Hayes. He liked Hayes and encouraged his fellow Ohioan to run, but Garfield felt that Hayes was a relatively weak candidate that would have little impact on the field because, quote, I do not find that the mention of his name excites much enthusiasm outside of Ohio. At the Republican National Convention in 1876, Senator James Blaine led on the first 6 ballots, but his support collapsed and the party eventually turned to Hayes. Though not his first choice, Garfield quickly offered his support to the Hayes campaign. Hayes emphasized the dangers of turning the federal government over to Democratic former rebels, the popular and effective old standby of waving the bloody shirt. This appealed to the partisan Republican Garfield, who took every opportunity to remind his constituents and others that, quote, this Democratic House is the most inefficient and discordant body I have ever been a member of. It was a good thing for the country that they got into power just enough to show their character. For anyone considering voting Democratic in 1876, Garfield reminded them that, quote, the Democratic Party has been and is now submissive to the despots of the South. They are wrong, and the Republican Party right, every time. Once Hayes was safely inaugurated as president after a disputed election, Garfield immediately recognized that he had a number of policy disputes with the new administration. The most obvious of these was over Reconstruction policy. Garfield was hesitant about the Hayes approach to Reconstruction, but tried to give the new administration a fair shake. President Hayes was convinced that his selection of former Confederate Lieutenant Colonel David M. Key to be Postmaster General would win him favor with Southern congressmen. When several Southerners seemed to offer to elect Garfield as Speaker of the House in return for Hayes putting Key in the cabinet, Hayes overplayed his hand and embarked on an effort to woo the South and build the Republican Party there. Hayes told Southern audiences that the federal government was done intervening on behalf of black men and women, and that federal money was coming for various infrastructure projects. He also gave over a third of Southern patronage jobs to Democrats. Garfield lamented that the Hayes effort to kill the South with kindness was backfiring. Of the president, Garfield wrote that, quote, he has offered conciliation everywhere to the South, while they have spent their time whetting their knives for every Republican they could find. The overtures to the South were, in Garfield's mind, threatening to split the party asunder, but Hayes disagreed. It seems, Garfield wrote, to be impossible for a president to see through the atmosphere of praise in which he lives. Garfield now found himself in the difficult position of, as House Minority Leader, working to keep his fellow Republicans loyal to a president with whom he himself disagreed on several pressing issues. The continuing racial problems in the South and the overall failure of Hayes's Southern policy came to a head during the waning days of the 45th Congress, due to end on March 4th, 1879. This Congress had a Democratic majority in the House, but a Republican majority in the Senate. This would change when the 46th Congress began with Democratic majorities in both houses. In early 1879, the House's Democratic majority attached riders to funding bills to prohibit the use of federal marshals to protect voters and prevent violence at the polls. Democrats had long opposed these measures as unlawful federal protection for black voters, who of course just happened to vote overwhelmingly for Republican candidates at this point. The Republican majority in the Senate naturally opposed these riders and refused to pass them. As a result, Congress failed to pass a bill appropriating $45 million in funding for the federal government's operations for the fiscal year beginning July 1st, 1879. To put it into 21st century terms that you will recognize, I'm sure, the nation faced an unprecedented government shutdown due to lack of appropriations. I have nightmares about those words. President Hayes called the new 46th Congress, with Democratic majorities in both houses, into special session on March 19th to deal with this issue. As the party's minority leader, James Garfield was the Hayes administration's chief lieutenant in the House of Representatives. Garfield rose to speak on March 29th and launched a blistering constitutional attack on the Democratic majority in a lengthy speech later published under the title Revolution in Congress. It was this speech, according to historian Heather Cox Richardson, that later made Garfield a viable presidential candidate. He told the House, quote, "I want it distinctly understood that if this House cannot have its own way in certain matters not connected with appropriations, it will so use or refrain from using its voluntary powers as to destroy the government. This is the proposition we confront, and we denounce it as revolution. In the last act of Democratic domination in this capital 18 years ago, the Democratic Party said to Republicans, if you elect the man of your choice, President of the United States, we will shoot your government to death. But the people of this country, refusing to be coerced by threats of violence, voted as they pleased and lawfully elected Abraham Lincoln. Then your leaders were heroic enough to withdraw from their seats and fling down the gauge of mortal battle. We called it rebellion." Though the main thrust of his argument was the unconstitutionality of the Democrats' approach, Garfield did not miss the opportunity to bring up the Democratic Party's role in secession and the Civil War. He was covering all of his bases to rally the public in support of the stand being taken by congressional Republicans and President Hayes. Even anti-Hayes administration Republicans like Senators Roscoe Conkling of New York and James Blaine of Maine spoke in the upper chamber in tones similar to Garfield's speech in the lower house. Conkling called it revolutionary that the money of the people shall not be used to maintain the government. Blaine, the senator from Maine, agreed. I call it the audacity of revolution for any senator or representative to get together and say, we will have this legislation or we will stop the government. Conkling and Blaine joined in Garfield's sly use of revolution, an obvious but effective reminder of the upheaval of the Civil War years. By tying the appropriations controversy to revolution, Garfield and his Republican colleagues effectively placed the blame for both the previous revolution of 1860 to 65, the Civil War, and any resulting revolution from an unfunded federal government squarely at the feet of the Democratic Party. Ultimately, it worked. Under a deluge of public outcry, Democrats, quote, completely abandoned the main ground which they first took and the most sensible among them do not hesitate to admit privately that it was wholly untenable, as Garfield privately noted. The Democratic-controlled Congress ultimately withheld a token of $600,000 of federal appropriations rather than the $45 million they initially sought. Garfield's powerful speech had an electric effect on the Republican Party and brought him a great deal of positive publicity for the next several months. I am now experiencing one of the ups of political life, he wrote on July 3rd, 1879. Ultimately, the special session of Congress had proved to be a victory for the Republican Party and for the Hayes administration. Garfield told his friend Burke Hinsdale that this special session of Congress has united the Republican Party more than anything since 1868 and bids fair to give us 1880. But who would be the Republican standard bearer in 1880? Hayes had long since decided to serve just one term as president, so the Republican presidential nomination in 1880 was wide open. The main contenders were James Blaine, Senator of Maine, Secretary of the Treasury John Sherman of Ohio, the brother of the famous General William Tecumseh Sherman that I mentioned earlier, and of course former President Ulysses S. Grant. Sherman had recently supported Garfield for a seat in the U.S. Senate, to which Garfield had been elected in early 1880, and which he would assume in early 1881. And Sherman was not shy about asking Garfield for reciprocity. Sherman asked Garfield to go to the Republican convention in Chicago and give the speech placing Sherman's name into nomination. When that convention deadlocked, many delegates fondly recalled Garfield's powerful speech for Sherman and started moving toward Garfield, not toward Sherman, toward Garfield as a compromise candidate. Garfield, to his own surprise, won the nomination on the 36th ballot and returned home to Ohio as the Republican candidate for President of the United States. Over the next 5 months, some 20,000 people visited his farm in Mentor, Ohio, near Cleveland, now James A. Garfield National Historic Site, to see the candidate and hear him speak. Garfield began giving speeches from his home's front porch, making his property the site of the nation's first ever front porch presidential campaign, a style of campaigning that was continued off and on for several decades afterwards. And here's the only photo of the Garfields actually on that famous front porch that I'm aware of, at least, during the 1880 campaign. Garfield's strategy in this front porch campaign did not include giving speeches about himself, his positions on issues, why he should be the next president, or any of the themes we now hear from presidential candidates every 4 years or 3 years or 2 years or roughly 10 minutes after the last election ends. In 1880, most Americans still considered it unseemly for a presidential candidate to overtly seek the office, though nearly all of them did so, of course, behind the scenes. Garfield instead spoke of the Republicans as the party of Lincoln and abolition and loyalty to the Union. These had always been reliable themes for Republicans, but things were a bit more complicated in 1880 because of Garfield's Democratic opponent. Winfield Scott Hancock was a West Point graduate, veteran of the Mexican-American and the Civil War, and still on active duty in the Army. Hancock had fought and bled and nearly died for the Union, including at the Battle of Gettysburg. In fact, 1880 was the only presidential election in American history in which both candidates were Union Civil War veterans. And Hancock's military record was far more impressive and longer than Garfield's. Hancock's status as a genuine Union military hero made Republicans hesitant to criticize Hancock too harshly during the campaign. They instead emphasized his complete lack of political experience and knowledge, including publishing a pamphlet entitled A Record of the Statesmanship and Political Achievements of General Winfield Scott Hancock, which contained only blank pages. On August 6, 1880, James Garfield was in New York City for one of the few trips he took during the presidential campaign. That night, he addressed a huge crowd of cheering supporters from the balcony of the Fifth Avenue Hotel. He surprised many by invoking the role of black soldiers in defeating the Confederacy during the Civil War. Quote, "Soon after the great struggle began, we looked behind the army of white rebels and saw 4 millions of black people condemned to toil as slaves for our enemies. And we found that the hearts of these 4 million were God-inspired with the spirit of liberty, and that they were all our friends. We have seen white men betray the flag and fight to kill the Union, but in all that long, dreary war, we never saw a traitor in a black skin. Our comrades escaping from the starvation of prison, fleeing to our lines by the light of the North Star, never feared to enter the black man's cabin and ask for bread. In all that period of suffering and danger, no Union soldier was ever betrayed by a black man or woman. And now that we have made them free, so long as we live, we will stand by these black allies. We will stand by them until the sun of liberty, fixed in the firmament of our Constitution, shall shine with equal ray upon every man, black or white, throughout the Union. On his way home from this trip, Garfield stopped in Chautauqua, New York, where he was serenaded by the Fisk Jubilee Singers of Fisk University, an all-black college in Nashville, Tennessee. About 6 weeks later, the Fisk Jubilee Singers visited Garfield's Ohio home and sang again for the candidate and his family. He and his wife invited them into their parlor, where an emotional Garfield told them, quote, "I would rather be with you and defeated than against you and victorious." Just 5 weeks later, James Abram Garfield, not quite 49 years old, narrowly won election as the 20th President of the United States. His popular vote margin was razor thin, numbering somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 votes of, as you can see, 9.2 million ballots cast. His Electoral College victory was more substantial, 214 to 155. Both men carried 19 states, and the 1880 election was the first ever instance of the so-called Solid South. Every single state south of the Mason-Dixon line voted for the Democrat Hancock. With Reconstruction mostly over, and most federal troops and carpetbag Republican governments gone, the Democratic Party was once again in control of the social, economic, and political life in the former Confederate states. Garfield might very easily have chosen to ignore civil rights and race relations in his inaugural address. For example, he was incredibly knowledgeable about fiscal issues. He cared deeply about education. He wanted to modernize the American Navy. Reconstruction, in the minds of most people at least, was over, and many radical Republicans believed the federal government had done all it could or should for African Americans. The temptation for Garfield to look only forward, not backward, must have been great. Instead, Garfield boldly and directly addressed civil rights. Quote, "The elevation of the Negro race from slavery to the full rights of citizenship is the most important political change we have known since the adoption of the Constitution of 1787. No thoughtful man can fail to appreciate its beneficent effect upon our institutions and people. It has freed us from the perpetual danger of war and disillusion. It has added immensely to the moral and industrial forces of our people. It has liberated the master as well as the slave from a relation which wronged and enfeebled both. It has surrendered to their own guardianship the manhood of more than 5 million people and has opened to each one of them a career of freedom and usefulness. It has given new inspiration to the power of self-help in both races by making labor more honorable to the one and more necessary to the other. The influence of this force will grow greater and bear richer fruit with the coming years. No doubt, this great change has caused serious disturbance to our southern communities. This is to be deplored, though it was perhaps unavoidable. But those who resisted the change should remember that under our institutions, there was no middle ground for the Negro race between slavery and equal citizenship. There can be no permanent disfranchised peasantry in the United States. Freedom can never yield its fullness of blessings so long as the law or its administration places the smallest obstacle in the path to a citizen. The early Republican philosophies of equality and governmental activism to benefit all Americans resonated with the young James Garfield and stayed with him even to his inauguration as president. So to those who knew him then, or those of us that study him now, it is no surprise that Garfield reiterated his own and the government's commitments to civil rights and equality in his inaugural address. Though many in the Republican Party had moved on from the racial issues of the Civil War and Reconstruction eras and sought new alliances with financiers and industrialists, James A. Garfield continued to believe that the government had not only the means, but also the responsibility to promote equality and opportunity for all Americans. We stand today upon an eminence which overlooks 100 years of national life, he told the inaugural crowd, a century crowded with perils, but crowned with the triumphs of liberty and law. And he would, he promised, help liberty and law prevail during his administration. With such a leader at the nation's helm, the next 4 or perhaps 8 years had the potential to be good ones, until a deranged assassin changed everything. Thank you. So I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have. It's 2024, so of course we have a website, of course we have social media, so please, if you're interested at all in any of those things, please do follow us on social media. I will say we have a pretty robust social media presence. We have a lot of fun on there, so follow us and join. The Garfield the blog address there is no longer good. I should have taken that off. We have all of our blog articles up on our regular website now, so you can still find all that stuff there. Yes, question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Todd, for
Sure.
coming to Lakeside, and you run a great site in mentors.
Thank you.
We appreciate that as well. My question goes to: has analysis been done that can be demonstrate that there were sufficient black votes in some of the northern and midwestern states to make Garfield the president?
Great question. He had a mic, so I assume everybody can hear that, right? Yeah, well, certainly it didn't. In fact, I'll go back here as I get a little context to answer that question. Come on. Here we go. This photo right here on the right, I hope this is the pointer. Yeah, this photo on the right, that's a group of black Civil War veterans that came to visit Garfield. That's his home and manor that we now have as the National Historic Site. This was in late October of 1880 when this picture was taken. Again, African-American voters were overwhelmingly Republican at this point. The Republicans were the party of Lincoln. They were the party of abolition, the party that kept the Union together. And they were the party that had for years enforced Reconstruction laws in the South that allowed black people to vote, that allowed black people to hold office. They had basically had the Army and federal marshals there to basically keep angry white Southerners who were overwhelmingly Democrats away from committing acts of violence against black voters and against black people and black families. So this photo was taken, I think it was October 25th, 1880. The very same night, I mean literally on the exact same day this photo was taken, that night, Frederick Douglass spoke to a group at Cooper Union in New York City. And it was a largely black audience. And Frederick Douglass said that night, James Garfield must be our president. I know Garfield, colored man. Take my word for it. He is right on our issues. So that's why I sort of at the beginning referred to Garfield as, in my view, kind of this last Lincoln Republican, the last Republican president who was really vocal about civil rights, and who kind of was from that original generation of Republicans when the party was formed in the 1850s. So certainly, yes, black voters did vote overwhelmingly for Garfield in 1880. There were plenty of black voters, especially veterans, who voted for Hancock too, primarily because of their allegiance to him as someone who had been a general in the Union Army. Now, of course, James Garfield was a Union general too during the Civil War, but Garfield was one of those. If you study the Civil War at all, you've heard the dreaded term political general. meaning somebody who didn't go to West Point, didn't have any real background in military service at all. Garfield was one of those. I mean, he offered his services to the governor of Ohio. He got a commission through the governor, and despite the fact that he knew very little about the military, he became an officer and eventually a general. Garfield is one of the political generals who, by most accounts, acquitted himself pretty well, actually. There were others who did that too. We tend to think of political generals as being all terrible, and they weren't. There were plenty that were actually quite good. There were some bad ones too, by the way. But you know, so certainly there were some who did feel some allegiance to Hancock because he was a career military officer. But white Southerners, you know, could not have asked for a better candidate in Hancock in 1880. Hancock is a lifelong Democrat. You know, he of course fought for the Union. He was one of those who didn't really feel like the war should have been made to be about slavery. But the thing that Hancock had done that made him palatable to white Southerners in 1880 as a candidate for president was that he had been placed in charge after the war. One of the Reconstruction divided the South up into these various military districts. Hancock had been placed in charge of one of the military districts that included New Orleans. And while he was there, he issued an order that the Army should have nothing to do with the civil and political life in this district. And therefore, of course, it was very easy then at that point for white Southerners to openly oppress and in some cases commit violence against black men and women. So even though Southerners were mortified at the idea of somebody like Hancock being president because he was a Union veteran, he was palatable to them because of that background as a lifelong Democrat, and really because of that controversial order he issued, I think it was around 1867, in one of those military districts in the South. They felt like this was a guy that they could live with because even though he was a Union veteran, even though he was a career military officer, he was still on active duty in the Army, in fact, as the commander of the Atlantic, the Department of the Atlantic. He was palatable to white Southerners in 1880 because of, you know, he had basically shown that he didn't think the government should really intervene to protect black voters or anything like that. And so white Southerners said, okay, we can get on board with that. And so he was a very good choice as a candidate in 1880 in that regard, meaning he could garner Southern votes. He was a very bad candidate in the simple fact that he had no political experience at all. You know, he knew Army politics very well, but he didn't know much about being a political candidate for a job that would require him to be a civilian and not be an Army officer anymore. So you know, he didn't talk to the public as much as Garfield did. Garfield was a lifelong politician. You know, had been in Congress for 17 years, was very comfortable being out in front of people and talking to them. Hancock was just the opposite. He kind of kept to himself and didn't sort of welcome the public with open arms to his home like Garfield did. So, but you should also get a sense too of just how divided the country truly was by the fact that, you know, Garfield wins this election by somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 popular votes. I mean, that's like, you know, 0.0001% or something like that. It's a very close election. Probably, I would have to say, probably the closest popular vote victory in American history, I think, because plenty of presidents, there have been several times where presidents lost the popular vote but still won the Electoral College and still became president. In this case, Garfield wins the popular vote by, you know, that much and then becomes president. So I think it's probably got to be the closest popular vote victory in American history. He's going around with the mic, so we'll.
Thank you. My question is pretty simple. How did James Garfield find his way to Williams?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so there were, you know, Garfield was, first of all, one thing to know about Garfield is he was, you know, I'm biased, obviously, but, you know, he was one of the most purely brilliant intellectual men ever to be president. He spoke many different languages. He had taught basically just about every subject there was to teach when he was a teacher prior to the Civil War. He had matriculated through the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, what's now Hiram College, and so he was looking for where to go to finish. You know, the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, was at that time, you know, today it's a private liberal arts four-year college. At that time, it would be more akin to what we would think of today as maybe like a junior college. So he had to go somewhere else to finish and get what we would call today a bachelor's degree. And so he considered a number of different schools, and most people, including his mother, thought he was going to go to a school called Bethany College, which at the time was in Virginia. It's now West Virginia, I think. But they thought he would probably go to Bethany because it was affiliated with the Disciples of Christ, which was the denomination that he and his family and his wife belonged to. But instead, Garfield made, I think, a very interesting and really self-aware decision specifically to go to Williams because he said, and I quote, that he wanted to get into that abolitionist atmosphere. He knew that Massachusetts was kind of ground zero for the abolitionist movement, and even though at this time, as a young man in Ohio and a very loyal member of the Disciples, he didn't think politics was gentlemanly. It was kind of dirty and not at all like today. It was not something that the Disciples really favored their members being involved with. He had that mentality, and yet, and I think it really shows just what a genuinely intellectually curious man he was, there was something nagging in his mind where he said, I want to get up there and see what it's all about. And so he specifically chose Williams because of that location. He went there in 1854 and worked, he got there and realized, oh my gosh, everybody here is so much smarter than me and they're all so much more advanced than I am. So I don't know how to do anything except work. So he just said, no one's going to work harder than me. And there were days where he remarked in his diary that he studied for 20 hours out of 24 hours. So he definitely worked hard. But yeah, he made a very specific choice to go to Williams because he wanted something up there in Massachusetts, in that area of the country, because he wanted to experience a different part of the country. He wanted to experience abolitionism. And there was a guy there who was the president of Williams named Mark Hopkins, who Garfield knew a lot about and was very attracted to the idea of going there and getting to work with Mark Hopkins. And then Garfield at one point very famously said or wrote that in his mind, the idea of the perfect college was Mark Hopkins on one end of a log and a student on the other. And so he had great affinity for Hopkins even for the rest of his life. Thank you.
I believe it's accurate to say that Chester Arthur, Garfield's vice president, was not well known outside of New York and was, as Garfield was dying, less than enthusiastic about becoming president. So how did he become the vice presidential candidate, and what was the relationship between Garfield and him? Okay, let's see. What time do we have to be out of here, John? I think he said I'm limited to 5 hours with you, so just kidding. No, it is a very involved question, so I'll try to answer it as best I can without being too verbose. So Garfield, Chester A. Arthur was a total product of New York City machine politics. He owed his entire career to the patronage system. If you recall, at one point I showed you a picture of Roscoe Conkling. Roscoe Conkling, the guy on the left here, Roscoe Conkling was the senior senator from New York, and he was the absolute king of the patronage system. And the patronage is that system that we don't have anymore, where if you are a member of Congress and you win elections, you can give jobs to whoever you want. Doesn't matter if they're qualified, doesn't matter if they know anything. If you want to be the postmaster of Mentor, Ohio, or you want to be the consul to Paris or Vienna, if you know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, then there's a chance you could get that job, regardless of whether or not you're qualified. And guys like Conkling loved this system because it allowed them to become very powerful. And it allowed them to dole out jobs to people who now owed them favors. So this is how politicians built bases of power at this point.
So guys like Conkling really loved this system. Chester A. Arthur, who was also a New Yorker, very close with Conkling, kind of an acolyte of Conkling's. Chester A. Arthur had been collector of the Port of New York in the 1870s during the Rutherford B. Hayes administration. And he was fired from that job by President Hayes for corruption. Your vice presidential candidate, ladies and gentlemen. So in 1880, Conkling, Arthur, and everybody that was loyal to them, they were very much pushing Ulysses S. Grant to run again in 1880. They had been very powerful during Grant's 8 years in office. They wanted Grant to come back and run again in 1880 and get another term in office, because then that would, of course, lead to more power for them. That obviously didn't happen. Garfield became the nominee, this kind of compromise nominee at that 1880 Republican convention. And Garfield, of course, was one of the most vocal people at that convention, saying, we cannot nominate Grant to run for a third term. Not because of anything really specifically about Grant himself. Grant's presidency had seen some scandals. I think that's Grant himself. I think it's been pretty well documented, was personally honest, but he didn't always have the best judge. He didn't always judge character very well, so he hired a lot of people that maybe he shouldn't have. So there had been some scandals during his presidency. But Garfield was one of the people at the convention saying, we cannot nominate him again. No one should run for a third term. Now, there's no constitutional amendment at this point that says you can't run for a third term. That doesn't come about until after FDR. And then the Republicans elect Dwight Eisenhower, who probably could have been elected 5 more times if he'd been able to run. Not that he would have wanted to, probably. But anyway, so there's nothing at this point that says somebody can't run for a third term. But Garfield is one of those who says, we should honor the example set by George Washington, that you serve 2 terms and then you go. And so Garfield, when Garfield became the compromise nominee, you hear sometimes even today about presidential and vice presidential candidates needing to have geographic balance, right? Well, if the presidential nominee is from the north, maybe you should nominate someone from the south or from the west, try to bring in votes. And there's plenty of research out there that shows people don't care about that at all. Nobody votes based on who the vice presidential candidate is. But anyway, there's still this idea that we need some kind of balance. So in this case, in 1880, they needed balance between the so-called half-breed Republicans who didn't want Grant to run again and the so-called stalwart Republicans who did. And so you don't get much more stalwart than Chester A. Arthur unless it's Conkling himself. So somebody approaches Arthur about being the vice presidential nominee at this convention in Chicago, and Arthur, who by the way was fired for corruption, as I already said, as collector of the Port of New York, and has never been elected to any office. He's never been a congressman or a senator or even a city councilman. Somebody approaches Arthur about the vice presidential nomination, so providing balance between the stalwart and the half-breed factions of the party, and also bringing together 2 of the most powerful states in the Union, Ohio and New York. And Arthur says, wow, that's a greater honor than I ever thought I could accomplish. So he goes to Conkling and says, they've offered me the vice presidency, what should I do? And Conkling says, if I were you, I would drop it like a hot shoe out of the forge. And Arthur, to his credit, says, well, I think I'm going to do it anyway. So Arthur becomes vice president. Garfield, of course, 4 months into his term is shot, doesn't die right away, lives 2.5 months after being shot. When Garfield is shot in July of 1881, there's a lot of speculation that perhaps the stalwart faction of the party had arranged for Garfield to be shot. And so Chester A. Arthur, who's from that faction, of course, wants nothing to do with this. He's in New York when it happens. He doesn't go right to D.C. He doesn't want to be seen to be, kind of coming in to, take power away from the wounded president. So in fact, Arthur remains in New York that entire 80 days that Garfield is trying to recuperate, and then eventually dies. And then when Garfield finally dies, and the message is relayed to Arthur that he now has to be sworn in as president, he says, I hope it's a mistake. So Arthur was aware of his own limitations. He knew he was only put on the ticket because he was a stalwart. And then, of course, guys like Conkling and Grant and others thought, ooh, now that Arthur's president, we're right back in. And to his credit, Arthur took the presidency very seriously and distanced himself from Conkling and Grant. And Chester A. Arthur, the ultimate stalwart, the ultimate example of patronage, the guy who was fired for corruption as a civil servant, in January of 1883 signs the Pendleton Act, which reforms the civil service and puts us into the system that we still have today, where people like me who have federal jobs have to be, somewhat intelligent, have to be able to spell their own names and demonstrate that they have qualifications and proficiency. And that's also why we now, when we are sworn in to our jobs, we take an oath to the Constitution, not to Roscoe Conkling or James Blaine or Chester A. Arthur or anyone else. The loyalty is to the country and to the Constitution, not to the person that put you into that job. So, Arthur to me is an underappreciated figure because he really did, he took the job very seriously when he became president. And of course, he was rewarded by being ceremoniously dumped by the Republicans in 1884. They nominated James Blaine there on the right, who had wanted to be president since he was about 3 weeks old. They nominate James Blaine in 1880, or in 1884 rather, and of course Blaine loses to Grover Cleveland. So Grover Cleveland then becomes the first elected Democratic president since James Buchanan. So didn't work out so well for Blaine. So anyway, that's a very long answer to a short question, but that's how Arthur came to be vice president. That's how he rose to the presidency upon Garfield's death, and then that's how he acted as president and how he was rewarded by not being nominated in 1884. Sure. I don't know if he's coming around with the mic. Oh, okay. Did you have one here? Yeah, go ahead.
I want to thank you so much for this presentation. Here I am.
Oh, it's like,
And, I've been coming to Lakeside for 51 years. I've been a resident of Ohio for almost 60 years. I've been to many, many presidents' homes. I've been writing a blog for 21 years, mainly about political subjects. I was on the faculty at OSU, and I have never had this man even cross a quote or a piece of paper, and I'm just thrilled to hear this, and I'm going to get out my computer today and just write about this guy because I think it was so exciting. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. And don't feel bad. I hear that a lot. People will walk in here and be like, James Garfield, he's president for 4 months. Why does he get a National Historic Site? And of course, once we talk to them a little bit, maybe not quite to this level of detail, but most people, I think at least, walk away with some better appreciation for who he was and why the site's there. And let me just say one more thing, and then I see you're there with a question. I don't know if anyone here knows the book Destiny of the Republic. Has anyone read that by Candace Millard? So really good book, came out I think around 2011 about, it was primarily about the assassination, and the science or lack thereof that the doctors applied to Garfield after he was shot. And really it's a chronicle of this sort of 80 days of misery that James Garfield had to endure. But she did a really nice job in there of explaining who Garfield was, and some of the stuff that we've talked about here, and why he was this unique individual who in all likelihood could have been a very good president. Anyway, that book is now, you'll be happy to know, being adapted into a dramatic series for Netflix. They just started filming this month over in Europe somewhere, and I don't know when it's going to come out. They are in touch with us, so they've been asking us a lot of questions, so I'm kind of going Hollywood here on you, I guess. But anyway, probably 18 to 24 months or so, it will actually air on Netflix. And I mean, it is like major Hollywood talent. This is a big deal, so it's going to be really cool. So I think I think that too is going to really open a lot of people's eyes to Garfield. You know, Destiny of the Republic, fantastic book. Candace Millard, incredibly wonderful, generous person, still very friendly with us at the site. But we all know more people are going to watch Netflix than are ever going to pick up a history book. So I think Netflix is going to send James Garfield into the stratosphere here pretty soon. So.
Yeah, since you mentioned the dispute between the half-breeds, which Garfield was, and the stalwarts, that Conklin was, I was reading in a book, and it said that because of that controversy, the Garfield picked certain people when he was elected that antagonized the stalwarts even more, and the leader of the stalwarts left the Senate, and there was such a fury about the whole thing that Garfield wanted to get away, and that's why he went to the train station. And then the next question is, it wasn't Union Station. Do you remember which train station it was? And the guy that shot him, what office was he seeking?
Okay, so it was the Baltimore and Potomac rail station in Washington, D.C., which is not there anymore, but if you've been to Washington, it is built on the location that is roughly now the National Gallery of Art. And about 6 years ago, I worked with some, because the back of the National Gallery of Art is the National Mall. And there was no marker anywhere near any of this that talked about Garfield and the assassination. So about 6 years ago, I got in touch with some people I know, some colleagues, Park Service colleagues on the National Mall, and we got together with we assembled this dream team of historians and writers who helped us write text. So we now have two what we call wayside, like exhibit panels about Garfield right behind, on the mall, right behind the National Gallery of Art, which is something like 400 or 500 yards from where the assassination actually took place, which is now in the middle of Constitution Avenue. So we're doing you a favor by not sending you into the middle of Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. So it was the Baltimore Potomac train station, again, not there anymore. Roscoe Conkling is the guy you're talking about here that, I mentioned that Chester Arthur had been collector of the Port of New York at one point. The best, most lucrative, cushiest civil service job in the whole system, and it was in New York. So Roscoe Conkling felt like he should be in charge of. Shut up! Nobody's talking to you. I don't know why that happens. So Conkling felt like he should be the guy that gets to pick the collector of the Port of New York. And when Garfield became president, he nominated somebody for that job, collector, that was not an ally of Roscoe Conkling. So Conkling and Thomas Platt, who was the other New York senator, threw a temper tantrum, and because they didn't want this guy to get this job. And so Garfield basically said, he writes in his diary at one point, we will see if I am the chief executive of the nation or the registering clerk of the Senate, basically saying, we're going to see what happens. So Conkling devises this plan where he and Platt, his junior colleague, will resign from the U.S. Senate in protest over Garfield's choice for the collectorship. They will go back to New York, and of course, how are senators elected at this point in American history? They're not elected by the voters, they're elected by the state legislatures. So Conkling and Platt will then go back to New York, and the New York legislature will promptly reappoint them to the Senate, and they'll ride back into Washington victorious, and James Garfield will have egg all over his face. And that is exactly what did not happen. The New York legislature said, we're happy to be done with these guys, and elected two other people. So that was Conkling and Platt that did resign from the Senate in protest, and their plan completely backfired. And Garfield at one point says in his diary, the chief method of political death is suicide after all, talking about these guys. So that was it. That was the end of, and Conkling had been an absolute powerhouse in Congress for 25 years, and that was the end of his career. So yeah, he never made it back to politics. Was there a third one in there that and Charles Guiteau was the name of the guy who shot Garfield. Guiteau, first of all, I have to say, completely mentally unbalanced for sure. Guiteau considered himself a Republican, and he considered himself a stalwart Republican, like Conkling and Grant. And he got it in his head because of the mental illness that he had been very important to Garfield winning the election. He was in New York, and New York was the critical state that put Garfield over the top in the Electoral College. So Guiteau, after the election, went to Washington and came to collect his reward, which was a job. Nothing major. He just wanted to be the American consul to either Paris or Vienna. No big deal. Needless to say, he's not qualified, has no experience, no recommendations for any of that. And he gets in line at the White House, as many thousands of people did at this time, to get an audience with the president to make his case to get this job. And yeah, this was a period in American history when the president is the servant of the people, and if the people are here to see the president has to see him. And so Garfield just wasted hours and hours and hours every day dealing with people who wanted jobs. And you can see him as you read his diary, getting just more and more frustrated. What might a vigorous thinker do if given the opportunity to use a presidential term to full effect or something along those lines? So he's getting really frustrated, getting really, irritated with this aspect of the job. And so at one point, Charles Guiteau goes to the State Department because James Blaine, there on the right, was Garfield's Secretary of State. He goes to the State Department to make his case for this job, and he actually sees Blaine walking through the lobby. So he goes up to Blaine, and Blaine already knows who he is because he's been hectoring, everybody from the president on down. And Blaine just says to Guiteau, "Never mention the consulship to me again," meaning it's not going to happen for you. You're not going to get this job. So then Guiteau decides, okay, so obviously James Garfield is taking the Republican Party and the country in the wrong direction because he's listening to half-breed Republicans like Blaine. He's going to ruin the party and ruin the country with civil service reform. So obviously the most logical thing to do is simply murder the President of the United States. That will make Chester A. Arthur president because we already established that Arthur's a stalwart. And Arthur will, of course, pardon Guiteau and give Guiteau the job that he wants. And so Guiteau begins basically stalking the President of the United States until finally on July 2nd, 1881, he's waiting in the train station because Garfield's travel schedule is published in the newspaper. And he walks into the train station with James Blaine, no Secret Service, none of that at this point. And he walks up and shoots Garfield in the back. And then Garfield endures the next 80 days of questionable medical treatment and all these other things, and eventually dies of infection on September 19th. So Guiteau, yes, if you read textbooks, he was a disappointed office seeker. Yes, that is true. He was also mentally ill, and he was also a political assassin. He had a definite political agenda when he shot James Garfield. And by the way, Arthur did not pardon him, did not give him a job. Guiteau was executed almost a year after shooting Garfield.
I had a question in reference to his wife. Can you give a little more background on her and her role during his career and her life after his death?
Sure. Mrs. Garfield, so Lucretia, her name was Lucretia Rudolph, was her maiden name. And in fact, she was from Northeast Ohio as well. They knew each other as, younger people. They had both gone to school at the Geauga Seminary and then both gone to school at the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, which of course is now Hiram College. In fact, Lucretia, who was also a member of the Disciples of Christ, her father was one of the founders of the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, now Hiram College. So they started, courting, I guess is the proper term, not dating there. And then, of course, he left for 2 years to go to Williams, came back. They married in 1858. The early years of their marriage were quite unhappy. He was gone so much. I mean, he was going back and forth to Columbus as a state senator. Then the Civil War comes, and he's gone for 2.5 years in the Army. So the first several years of the marriage were, and at one point, she kind of confronts him about this, and he basically tells her that he thought the marriage was a mistake, which is just what every young bride wants to hear, right? So the first several years, she later called them the dark years. But They had a daughter named Eliza, their first child, and Eliza died in December of 1863, right as Garfield was going into the House of Representatives. And they of course had to come together to mourn their daughter, and I think that was the thing that kind of flipped the script for them a little bit, to the point where after that, they had a very loving relationship. They were very much, partners in a lot of ways. She was also highly educated, very smart. He wrote in his diary that she was his intellectual equal in every way. She, of course, it's the 19th century, so she's not out there talking about her own opinions about things, but privately, she's more than happy to share her views on things with him. Of course, he dies. They're very young. They're both 49 when he dies. Excuse me. So she lives another 36 and a half years after his death. She lives until 1918, and during that time, she never remarries. She ends up with a fairly substantial amount of money that the American public had basically donated for her after the president's death. So she had money to live on. She owned the property that is now, our site in Mentor, that is now James A. Garfield National Historic Site. She owned that for the rest of her life. She lived there regularly, not, especially later in life, she started going out to Southern California for the winters, which I hear are much nicer than those in Northeast Ohio. And in fact, their daughter and her husband had started living out there in South Pasadena, and so that's where she died actually in March of 1918. But she never remarried. She said that her primary goal was to make a good life for her family, and she did something really unique, which is with some of this money that she'd been given, she built a memorial library on the back of the house that we now consider to be the birthplace of the idea of presidential libraries. And so, I know you guys, some of you were probably here yesterday for the presentation by the guy from the Hayes Center in Fremont, which is an awesome place. We kind of have a very friendly back and forth with them about who really has the first presidential library. Of course, Mrs. Garfield's library was for herself and for the family. It wasn't for the public. So really, the Hayes folks do have the first presidential library that we think of in modern terms where people go and do research. But Mrs. Garfield also got very interested in a lot of different things. Later in life, she got interested in architecture. One of their sons ended up becoming an architect. She got interested in landscape design. She had this beautiful landscape plan done for our property in Mentor. And she even got a little bit interested in progressive politics later in life, too. She volunteered for the American Red Cross out in South Pasadena during World War I when the U.S. entered World War I. So yeah, she became a very active woman and really did a lot of things right up until the end of her life. But yeah, she never remarried. She kind of took on the role of kind of being a public widow. Always perpetually mourning for her murdered husband. And so a lot of times in photos of her later in life, when you see photos of her, she's wearing like a black dress, or she would write letters on stationery that had black borders, that just kind of to symbolize being that presidential widow. So yeah, she had a good long life after his death.
And one last question.
Sorry.
I don't want people to think I'm a shill, but could you tell us what improvements the National Park Service has made to the historic site since it was taken over by them?
Sure. So our site in Mentor was initially given to an outfit from Cleveland called the Western Reserve Historical Society, which is still there, still in Cleveland, still very, very well known. So in the 1930s, when the last family member died and wasn't living in the house anymore, the children, the 5 surviving Garfield children, eventually made it a gift to the Western Reserve Historical Society to be operated as a museum. And so the Western Reserve Historical Society owned was on the property, did all of the tours, all the special events, all the visitor services for really from 1938 when they opened it, or 36 rather, excuse me, all the way up until the beginning of 2008. The National Park Service came on board to this site as a partner in 1980. Our role for most of that time was fairly minimal. We had a groundskeeper, we had one or maybe two employees. And it was still operated by the Western Reserve Historical Society. In the mid-1990s, the National Park Service did come in with $12.5 million to put the house back in the condition that you see it in today if you visit us, and that you can kind of see in these photos. So the house, a number of the buildings had kind of fallen behind on preventative maintenance. And so the Park Service came in, did a complete restoration of the house, put the house back into an appearance from roughly the time that the Memorial Library was built, and that's this thing here on the right, this top right photo there. Rebuilt the windmill that you see down there at the bottom, basically made the site what you see today if you come see us. And then, that was in the mid-1990s, the house reopened to the public, was closed for about 3 years during all this renovation and restoration. The house reopened to the public in 1998. Then at the beginning of 2008, the Western Reserve Historical Society left the property completely in the hands of the National Park Service. So we have, our job there is we do all the visitor services, all the special events. We maintain the buildings. The restoration that was done in the mid-1990s is now showing its age too. So we're now talking about how much money do we need to do a restoration of the restoration. It's going to be, not $12.5 million certainly, but it's going to be sizable just because we're right on Menor Avenue and all the salt comes up, onto the house in the wintertime, and the sun and the extreme weather that we have sometimes. So the buildings are definitely ready to have some more work done, but we have to compete for that money with 428 other units of the National Park Service. So, but anyway, so we've done quite a bit. Even when we were just a partner here, the Park Service provided all this funding for the restoration, and now we do everything there. We are the only ones on site now. The Western Reserve Historical Society isn't there anymore, so it is completely a unit of the National Park Service now. Thank you.